Hi, I'm Jason Baldridge. It's my pleasure to give a talk for the EVAL workshop focusing on the importance and impact of language in embodied vision and language tasks. I'm calling it Language Lifts Experience, and I hope it'll be clear why later on as I go through the talk, why I'm calling it that. So one of the core problems that many of us are working on is vision and language navigation. And it's still the case that we can't follow fairly simple instructions like this. Hang a right before the statue of the horses, but avoid the bikes and trash cans, and then climb the set of stairs. Just a couple of things to note here is that we are talking about things like hanging a right before the statue of the horses. Before is actually a temporal term, not a spatial term, but we use it to talk about spatial relations, especially when we're working with a trajectory, for example. Also, avoid is a negation marker, so we're being told not to go up and get close to certain things like bikes and trash cans. And this is, I think, an important thing for our data sets to be focusing on, which is you should be able to follow some instructions, and that includes not doing some things. And I'll give you an example of a data set that we're working on right now that has these kinds of examples. So we are still, I think we've made a lot of progress on connecting language to the visual world and to actions, but we're still far from what we need to be at. Hopefully this talk will suggest some ways in which we can make progress toward that. So some broad questions that I'm interested in. First of all, one of the big ones, which is, what is meaning? It's something that's motivated me ever since I started studying computational linguistics. And I'm really excited about the opportunities that we have now with our new models, our new data sets and environments, and the ways that we can address this. And I'll kind of give a little bit of a quick historical take on that and return to that later. In particular, one of the things that I think is the best progress or the best opportunities we have for progress in this area is relating language to inner brain structures and to the outer material world. So I think a lot of the folks in this workshop will be very focused on and probably convinced by the idea that we have to be grounding language in the material world or possibly in some kind of game-like world and so on. But I also think we need to think about brain structures and the connection to how we actually process information at a fairly low neural level. I then would like to make some arguments that language actually has a huge role in intelligence. And so this is a question that is an open question for me, but I'm growingly convinced that language is fundamental to certainly an individual's ability to think and to think more broadly, but then especially for a group of speakers to think collectively. I'll give some more detail into that. So how do we make progress towards addressing these questions? And I think it's exactly the kind of stuff that people at this workshop are kind of butting into, but maybe we can think about how we structure these things as we continue to move forward. Essentially, we have this big moonshot, right, where we want to build these agents that can interact with the real world and use language effectively, maybe between each other and between the agents and actual people. And that's a pretty tall order. So we kind of need a series of roof shots to get us there. So what does that look like? So my early version of what I thought semantics was very much of the kind of logical framework, right? I worked in categorical grammar, and it had this really nice property that you could have syntax and semantics work in parallel. And I thought, gosh, I'm doing my job if I can have my syntactic categories lined up with the right semantic types. And after analyzing a sentence like this, which is in Haida and means I made all those cookies, I produced this logical form that you see at the bottom. And gosh, that's my meaning, right? And so I kind of thought, job done. Well, you know, I was at the University of Texas at Austin. I joined in 2005, and you know, I was talking to Ray Mooney and showing him the kinds of analyses that I would produce with my categories and whatnot. And he'd say, well, if I can't do anything with your logical forms, they don't mean anything. And I was like, okay, he's right. But it still took me a little while to come around to that perspective. In the meantime, Katrin Eric was also there and interested in distributional models for semantics. And so she would ask me questions like, well, what is the meaning of life prime after all, right? If you look at things like this, I've got things like cookies and make and I and so on. And those are just stand-ins for some richer kinds of semantics. And so Katrin was really interested in how we could use distributional models where we build distributed representations of, say, words given their collocational patterns in text, and then seeing if we could actually derive semantics from that. And Ray and Cotran actually worked on some nice ways of combining logical forms with distributional semantics in the sort of 2010 period. So both of these researchers and friends really pressed me to think a bit more about how I was construing meaning. And one of the outcomes of that was I started working a little bit more on grounding, in particular an area that I like to think of as grounding light, which is connecting language to geography and time. So not really relating language, say, to a visual environment or an actual embodied environment, but instead relating things like words like beach to their geographical context or to their temporal contexts and so on. And, after discussing a lot with Cotran, I was thinking, well, what we really need are these kind of distributional vectors that you might see as like a dictionary-based vector up there. And, this is pre-Word2Vec. We had plenty of distributional models that were not sort of neural embeddings and so on. But they were a way of characterizing the meaning of a word in terms of some semantic space. But I wanted to start sneaking in some more external context into that via things like geography and time. I also thought, hey, it'd be really cool if we could do something with images, but I didn't really know how to work with them, and we didn't really have all the kind of neural tools that we have now for working with images so effectively and having the representations produced by images so kind of compatible with the textual representations that we were doing. So I didn't know how to do this back then, and the kind of picture of the beach there was, I don't want to say an afterthought, but it was very much a, I hope this could work out. And I actually see now how things are working out, especially as we build things like dual encoders over image and text captions and use retrieval to learn representations of both images and text that are kind of in the same space. So we've made a lot of progress toward these things. Now, I would also sort of point out my background in categorical grammar. I didn't want it to just stop with some, say, multi-component representation of a word like beach, but I wanted those to be able to be composed into some kind of broader representational structure that would have, for example, the representation of the children visit the beach would be something that has a core predicate, visit, and the predicate is no longer visit or visit prime or visit 42 or whatever. Instead, it's this multi-component version of visit that brings in sort of the dictionary level view, the geographic view, the temporal view, and the image view. And I've kind of indicated the size of those differently to show like how much meaning you would get, say, out of a visual component for visit. It's not very good, actually. You need an actual event, and it's hard to just represent visit as an image. On the other hand, stuff like children and beach have pretty good visual components, and so we might actually be able to weigh those components more heavily. And I still was thinking in terms of direct relations, like, we have the children being the agent of this predication and the beach being the sort of patient of that. I'm not sure that that's what we need right now, and I think it's really exciting, some of the representations that are coming out of even things like BERT that are learned only from text, but that seem to be sort of structured like representations that bring in sort of implicit characterizations of syntax and other kinds of phenomena like co-reference. So I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I do think we need something that is capturing both this sort of structure and the multiple different dimensions. So my view today is that we're going to get there most quickly and most effectively if we think about the fact that people learn language from speech while interacting with the environment and other people. And so that's what we should kind of strive for our machines to do. So what does that look like? I really like the paper Experience Grounds Language that this Holtzman, Thomason, and others recently put forth, where they characterize world scope for the kind of work that we do in terms of these 5 different levels that go from corpus to internet to perception to embodiment and social. So we've done a ton of the kind of corpus level work in natural language processing. That's the bread and butter of what we've done for forever, basically. And in the last 2 decades, we've brought the internet in, which basically gives us a ton more context and gets us out of just working with, say, like the Brown corpus or the Wall Street Journal. But more excitingly, in many ways for me, is the fact that image captioning has really come to the fore, and now we can actually start relating language to images. And that includes both text to images and actual audio to image. And I really like some of the data sets and work that Dave Harwath and others have done, where you have new data sets like the Flickr audio captions corpus or the Places audio captions corpus that relate audio descriptions to images. There's really interesting work that comes out when you do that. So we're starting to move up in the levels of this world scope kind of framework that the Experience Grounds language paper mentions. And recently, you can kind of continue to refine this sort of WS3 level. And there's another really exciting data set that came out this year called Localized Narratives, where you don't just have audio or text and an image, but you actually have both audio and text aligned with mouse traces that are about the thing that's being described. So for example, an annotator for Localized Narratives would give a description. In the front portion of the picture, we can see a dried grass area with dried twigs. And as they're saying dried grass area with dried twigs, they're moving their mouse over that, which you can see where the mouse trace in the image is color-coded to the words that were being spoken at the time that the mouse was being brought over those things, right? So now you have a very fine-grained relation between the words and the visual elements in the picture. So it adds quite another level of richness to the annotations. This has over 800,000 images that are annotated in this way over both MS COCO and the Open Images dataset and some other image captioning, popular image datasets. Then we can now move beyond planar images into, I guess I have to do this, into panoramic viewpoints. And the Refer 360 dataset that was introduced at ACL this year is a nice example of this, where you have a panoramic image and a person needs to identify an arbitrary location where maybe Waldo is hidden and give instructions such that another person can orient themselves and then continue to refine where they're looking within this entire panoramic space until they identify an exact point that is being described. So this now has this thing of having kind of both a trace type element and now in panoramic space rather than just planar image space. Then the popular room-to-room data set, which I think most people at this workshop will be quite familiar with, brings us now to a level where we have a series of connected panoramas that are part of an environment such as a building or a house. And then we have instructions for how to get from one point in this environment to another point in this environment. And an agent that's going to solve this task has to make decisions about relating language to the visual environment at any given panorama, and then also how to take actions to move through that and follow the instructions successfully. I think most people are familiar, so I'll move on quickly. A data set that we are now working on and will be releasing soon is Room Across Room, which kind of takes us to another level in terms of scale, as well as bringing in this kind of localized narratives perspective on the vision and language navigation problem. And I should mention as well that both of these last two bring us up into the level of WS4, which has embodiment and is part of continually kind of climbing that ladder of the levels of interactions that the authors and I believe are needed for learning language more effectively and relating language more effectively to the real world. So I'll give more detail about the Room Across Room data set, but the thing to really note here is that we are going to have fine-grained, almost like mouse trace-like, or in this case, pose trace information that connects the words that are being said by somebody giving an instruction to the visual environment. That means within every panorama, we know what they're looking at as they're saying the words, and then as they move through the environment, we can kind of keep track of this sort of actions in both panorama space and in the overall environment space. The next thing we need to focus on is social, and how do we bring multiple agents into environments like these so that they can be interacting and dealing with things like pragmatic inference and come into agreements about how they solve tasks. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Notice that all these three that are pointed out to here actually have speech in them. And I think that's important because eventually we need to have agents that can interact naturally with people. And text is not the most natural way for people to interact, especially if they're trying to solve tasks in some environment. So I do think we need to kind of get off the text bandwagon and start focusing on speech more and more. So I'm not going to talk about exterior vision and language navigation, but I want to take the opportunity just to give a plug for people who are interested in working on that problem. That the Touchdown data set is a great data set for working on this. And importantly, you can use the touchdown data set now with a very a vetted and approved set of panoramas that are released as part of the StreetLearn data set. And that means that these have all been, they're part of a data set that's been approved for use for academic research. And if you have an interest in working on problems that involve things like street view panoramas, please work with teams like mine to figure out how you can maybe use the StreetLearn data set to build new annotations, say, for these tasks. Or if you want to incorporate new panoramas, please talk to me first, because it's not a straightforward thing. We really need to focus on questions of privacy and also being compliant with the terms of service of these kinds of utilities such as Street View. However, a lot of the work that has been going on has been around the room-to-room data set. And there's a whole host of approaches that focus on different kinds of models and agents for following the instructions in the room-to-room task and moving around the Matterport 3D environment to do so. Now, my own team has done some of this work, and I'll highlight the ACL paper that we had last year very briefly, but it sort of really motivates the data set, this room across room data set that I'll be talking about in just a moment. And the tagline for this is putting language back in vision and language navigation. And the kind of core motivation that we had was we kind of noticed that you could, according to the paths in room to room, which are all shortest paths directly from the start point to the end point, you could, in theory, just go straight to the end goal, maybe by just identifying the last few words that are described to end the instruction, such as, you know, stop in front of the mirror, hey, go get to the mirror, and now you have maybe 0 navigation error. But you might not have actually followed most of the instruction. And certainly for me as a language person, I'm most interested in this if this can be a task that tests your ability to actually attend to the language and do what the language is saying, not just get to, say, the endpoint. Now, that said, one of the things I love about these kinds of tasks is that the metrics are about, hey, did you actually solve the task? So what we did is sort of say, well, the task isn't just to get to the end, the task is to follow the path that's been described, all right? And the reason we might be interested in this is if you consider this orange path as a schematic of the actual gold standard path that you would like a person to follow given those instructions, well, what we would like to have is a person not take the red path and get straight to this point that's pretty close to that goal, because there might be some kind of hazard or thing that, some other reason why we don't want them to go that way. And so what we wanted was to build some kind of data set that would allow us to test this and then be able to add a path fidelity metric into our reinforcement learning agents that would help them conform to the path. So we didn't have data that would have these kinds of paths that would have hooks in it that would test the ability of the agent to do better than just going straight to the goal. So we built a quasi-synthetic data set by piecing together room-to-room paths that were close enough in their start and end points. So for example, if this blue trajectory right here is one room-to-room path and its ending point is close to the start of another room-to-room path, then we can join those together to create one room-for-room path that now is a longer path that has a hook in it. Okay, so now if I were to take just this orange path straight to the goal, I would have 0 navigation error, but I would not have conformed to the path. We came up with a metric, CLS, that measures how closely you follow the path rather than just getting to the end goal. We since have a better metric that is based on dynamic time warping that you should check out if you're interested in these things. So the whole point, though, is that this allowed us to actually test agents that were rewarded purely for getting to the goal and agents that were rewarded both for fidelity to the path as well as getting to the goal. And what we found is that the latter agents performed much better on this CLS metric, which measured whether they got to the goal. The problem was that this was synthetic data, right? This first, the instruction for this first path might have come from one annotator, and then this other one would have come from another annotator. So together, this wasn't like one coherent style of providing an instruction from start to finish. And it's also just joining two things. So it's not really a fresh, complete annotation for this thing. So we've created a new data set. And we wanted to address these path biases, but also address the bias that we only have English data for this vision and language navigation problem right now. And so we provide English, Hindi, and Telugu which gives us 3 languages that are from different language families, and should provide a really nice new stress test for how well our agents are working. It's also 10 times larger than previous data sets that are in the vision and language navigation space, with 126,000 instructions and 18 million words. So this all, I think, will be really exciting to be able to work on in the vision and language navigation space. But we actually went further, and as I mentioned before, we were inspired by the localized narratives data set to actually capture the spatial temporal groundings as the annotators, the guides, were providing their instructions. So I'll show you an example of how this looks in the upcoming slides. So this is an annotation example that will give you a good sense of the flavor of what our annotations look like. What you see on the top left is the visual that the annotator, the guide, sees as they're going to be creating an instruction. On the right, you see the full panorama that is accessible to them at this particular node, and you're going to see kind of the clearing of that panorama is the visual sweep that they do as they're looking around. If I just advance this a little bit, you'll be able to see that sort of sweep start to happen. Okay, so I'm going to play this and let you hear the annotators speak as they go along, and after they're done speaking and giving that annotation, they go back and then provide their own transcription. So we have a high quality transcription, and then we use dynamic time warping to align the transcribed text to an ASR version of the audio text, so that we then have a fine-grained connection between the textual words and the visual that is being looked at as the annotator is going. So you'll see this as it goes along.
The wooden rafters of a cottage-like domicile from the 2nd story, perhaps the 3rd. The 3rd story indeed. Turn to your right. You should see a carpeted hall that follows along the banister, but you want to go to the room immediately to your right.
Notice these
inside
and arrows show
is
the
blue striped
that annotator is following.
wallpaper. Hug the counter to the left and move towards the black chair on the left. Continue behind the chair and then into the middle of the open double doors. You should have a standing mirror just to your right and a small table between you and the striped bed. Move towards the nightstand on the right side of the bed, as if you're going to turn off the lamp. Once you are in the middle of the nightstand, the small writing desk, and the table with Kleenex on it, you're done. Also, this bedroom has a bathtub in it, and I don't like that still. I will never like that.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in that particular annotation. This is perhaps our most creative annotator guide from our US English pool. And I actually think that that's very much a feature of this particular data, because at the end of the day, when we start having people intermixing with our agents, they're not going to just provide cut and dried stuff. They're going to actually provide, oh, oops, I got that wrong. Let me think about that again. What are we doing? If you're actually getting into, say, like a game environment where you have an agent interacting with a person and they're trying to collaboratively solve a task. So when we actually look at these alignments, we can see kind of what, within any given panorama, what did the annotator look at? We generally see a fairly wide sweep as the annotator orients themselves in order to decide how to start giving their instructions. So in the first panorama there on the left, you see they've actually looked at quite a large percentage of the overall panorama environment. That said, they don't look at everything. And then as they kind of go forward, they tend to look a little bit less, unless they get into a point where they kind of have to make a choice point between a couple things, and they're trying to figure out, how do I describe this most effectively? And a key thing to realize here is that when we have a person create a guide annotation, later on we're going to have a follower come along and validate that particular instruction and see if they can successfully get to the goal location. And if that doesn't succeed, we're going to have to throw that out and have basically get that guide annotation again. So long story short, you can see that as the guide is moving through the panoramas and scanning through them, you can see that the words that they're talking about are very much connected to the visual field that they have encountered for each panorama, including things like that gray colored ball that you see in the second panorama from the right. Now, we then, as I mentioned, have a follower come along, and they do the same thing, except now they don't have the kind of train track that the guide was on. They have to just use the language to mediate their movement through this environment. And they can go completely in the wrong direction if the guide's instructions aren't very good. And one of the things that we found was that guides actually got much better after they did a couple of follower tasks, right? They actually understood, well, what is it that's hard about being a follower or wayfinder? And then their ability to produce high quality guide instructions would go up. So one of the interesting things here is that we don't get the post traces only for the guides, we do that also for the followers. So now we can see, as a follower is trying to understand what a guide has said, what is the sort of scope of the visual environment that they are considering. And you can kind of see that it's not exactly the same, but often there is quite a high degree of overlap. But it's also not the exact same path, as you can kind of see from these examples. One of the interesting things about that is that actually now we get new slight variations of paths that get you to the same point that can be used as additional training data. And you see some other nice things, such as the follower will do things like verify that they got to see that gray colored ball in the corner at the very end. You see that in the bottom right panorama. The guide themselves actually saw that gray colored ball in the second to last panorama and then just sort of made that last move and stopped. Whereas the follower's like, okay, let me make sure I got to the right spot and then verify, and then they're done. So I think there'll be some really interesting things that we can do looking at both the guide and follower post-trace alignments going forward. So this also sets us up to be able to do basically a 3D re-rendering of a particular annotation trajectory. So you can see here, similar to the localized narratives mouse trace thing, we can have an aligned post trace that goes through the 3D environment and shows what the annotator was looking at as they said each one of these words. And so you can kind of see the color coding here and nice things that kind of come out of that. For example, as you can see this kind of coloring down here of this arrows point to like what was the actual direction of the post trace as the annotator was saying a particular thing. You can see that this is like a long beige sofa, and you can actually see that sweep as they were saying the words. I think it's really important that this was collected in audio and not in text, because now the annotator was free to sort of move around, look around, and then talk as they were doing it, rather than kind of type, move, type, move. So we did an analysis of linguistic phenomena in RxR, inspired by a similar analysis that was done for the touchdown data set. And some of the things that come up with these instructions that we're collecting are especially a wider use of coreference. And in part, this is because we have longer paths. So RxR is designed to have a much broader variation in path lengths, whereas RxR was all about 5 to 6 steps in general. And so there's a broader set of paths. Those paths can kind of loop back. We addressed the path biasing by basically having a room sampling procedure, and then we did shortest paths constrained by the room visitation schedule. And that could actually bring you from if you had 2 rooms like this, you could have a room that kind of, a path that goes through other rooms and ends up back in a room that was adjacent to the room that you started with. So now you have sort of a sensible visitation schedule. Like there's a reason why you might want to have visited those rooms in that particular trajectory. And it's not just sort of like a zigzag or something that has a hook in it just because it has a hook in it. All right, so, but the fact that we have these longer paths now means that we're doing a lot more work to reference the objects in the environment and then say like, okay, now that you're past it, move on, or and so on. So coreference comes up more. There's a lot more of this sequencing, again, because you're dealing with longer paths and wanting to make sure that people can follow the path and not just get to the end. There's also a lot more allocentric relations, right? So where you're relating objects to each other, or the person who's giving the instruction to orient themselves, as you recall in that example where the person was saying, you know, you should be in the middle of this, this, and that, right? So you can actually really get a sense of where you should be and not just be guessing, well, am I close enough or am I not close enough? There's also a lot more temporal conditions, things like move around the island until you come to the whatever. So that's also at a higher rate in the room across room data set. And then a lot more state verification. And this again was important because of the emphasis on path fidelity and making sure that the followers could not just get to the end, but they could also follow the path that you were on. And our instructions to the annotator said, like, you're actually in a room that's a house that's full of dangerous traps, and now you need to give instructions for a friend to later follow that same path without stepping on those traps. And so they did a lot more of this kind of checking where you are. A couple more example instructions just to show some phenomena that are coming out of this, including these kind of allocentric relations and things like a white lamp to the side of it, so that shows both co-reference and relating the white lamp to the side of the white couch so that you can now relate your locations in that way. Also, things that do appear in the room-to-room data set, but there's quite a lot of this counting, like the third book rack. In room-to-room, you see a lot of things like stop on the 7th step or enter the 2nd door on the right, and there's a lot of that going on in room across room as well. I think that's a really important thing that we haven't actually addressed or solved sufficiently in the sort of vision and language navigation space. As I mentioned in the earlier slide that showed the example of the horse statues, negation is important. And this second example shows a situation where you're supposed to go into the room which does not have a mat. So if all you have is a model that's going to look for high correlations with, oh, there's a mat and there's a room, I'm going to go to that room that has the mat, it's going to go wrong in this particular case. So I think that's important there. And then our very creative annotator really comes up with wonderful descriptions of things that are beyond just the, oh, brown statue. Instead, it's a weird little statue that's staring at you and has lots of nice descriptions of movement, like skirt around it. And in the example I showed before, you had hug the countertop or that kind of thing. And so, and you even see the annotator not quite sure if they describe something right. So for example, is that greenish tile wall? Oh, wait, that was not tiled at all. It's just a green pattern. And so these are some of the kinds of things that I think agents will need to be able to deal with, is understanding what is actually in the instruction that I need to attend to, and how do I actually adopt to and address some of these kinds of disfluencies in descriptions that are quite natural disfluencies, given that the annotator doesn't get to kind of walk the path before and decide, oh, I'm going to call this a green patterned wall. And instead they kind of have to do this on the off the cuff and on the fly. And I think that'll get us closer to this sort of setting where we have, say, games where people are interacting with people, or people are interacting with agents, or agents are interacting with agents, and they need to be able to describe things in real time while they're trying to avoid not getting like captured by some other game component, or trying to solve a task, for example. So I think this is an important step, but one issue with vision and language navigation is that there's a very limited action space, right? It's basically, move within this environment using the valid kind of point-to-point paths that are common in a lot of the room-to-room work. Or if you're using like AI habitat, you can do this in continuous space, but it's still sort of just movement, right? And there are answers to this in data sets in environments like Alfred, where you now have the ability to make coffee or cut things and so on. But what I like about the sort of Matterport 3D setting, or say the Street View setting, is that you're dealing with photorealistic spaces, and that connects us more closely to the actual material world rather than kind of a game-like world. So it's a trade-off that we all make as we're thinking about embodiment and connecting vision and language in these settings. And the trade-off that our team is focusing on is sticking to these sort of photorealistic representations of the material world rather than sort of a more game-like environment. So that said, like, we can all agree, like, there are many different ways that we can tackle these. So kind of what's missing, what's next? And I mainly want to focus on what's the role of language in this space. So I'm going to diverge a little bit and just talk a little bit about some issues in linguistic representation that I think should be kept in mind. So I probably don't have to convince too many people who are in this workshop that you probably shouldn't just learn by text alone. And one of the reasons for that is we need to be able to represent situations and what's going on in the situations described by a bit of text in order to really understand what's going on. And so this is an example where you can kind of have two different trajectories while holding the first and third sentences the same. You can have a pretty big difference that's completely predictable meaning change. So if I say, John put some beer in a cooler and went out with his friends to play volleyball, and I follow that up by, soon after he left, someone took the beer out of the cooler. And then I say, John and his friends were thirsty after the game and went back to his place for beers. When John opened the cooler, he discovered the beer was gone. Nobody is surprised to hear the word gone because they know that the beer was gone and they've built a representation of that situation. The cooler has no beer. And they knew that by the second sentence. Now, if you instead said that someone took the ice out of the cooler, we would now expect the beer to be warm. And that has sort of two components to it. One, I know that the ice is not in the cooler. And secondly, when the ice is not in the cooler, the beer will get warm, right? And so this requires sort of two levels of inference. And I'm doubtful that GPT-3 and friends will be able to sort this out. Maybe they'll, by accident, get something like this right. I don't know. But in general, I doubt that they're going to be able to capture this kind of thing, which is completely simple, predictable, and whatnot for humans. And in fact, just keep in mind that we could sort of separate the sort of what are currently the second and fourth sentences by arbitrary amounts of material, and a person could still answer this, right? Because they're building up a representation of the situation. So bridging references a well-studied phenomenon in linguistics. And the reason I bring it up is that it's really about what is brought to mind as I start to describe a situation. And that will connect into building broader understandings of situations that I think are important for the kinds of stuff that we work on. So if I say something like, I had a tasty dinner last night with my friends, it's absolutely unsurprising and easy to accommodate if I follow it up with, unfortunately, the wine was not a perfect match for my meal. It's a reasonable inference that wine went with a tasty dinner. And almost anybody would have no problem accommodating the sentence A as the follow-up to the first one. However, if I start to diverge a little bit more, things get a little bit harder to accommodate. And I can say, unfortunately, the bones took a lot of work to pick through. And that's kind of like, wait, what? Yeah, that didn't quite make sense. Now, if I'd said I had a tasty fish dinner last night with my friends, that would probably be a lot more easy to accommodate, because when I say fish, in the context of eating, I might have to work with bones on that. And so, and this is sort of, I needed the fish in that first sentence in order to bring the bones to mind. Now, if I followed it up with C, unfortunately, the lawyer was at a table near us. That would be really hard to kind of accommodate. Again, I would have had to say, I had a tasty dinner last night with my friends, after the court case. Then you might be able to have the lawyer in context. And so we're constantly having our sort of associative memory that is cueing our minds to be ready to think about other things that were in the context. And this actually plays a big role in things like spatial prepositions. So these can also impact this sort of bridging interpretations. So for example, if I say, John drove his car to the house, both cars and houses have doors, right? And if I say the door, I might be referring to the car door or the house door. So if I say something as simple as, he had trouble getting in because the door was stuck, now I know that that was the house door, right? Because I can't get in. He's in the car when he drives in, and I have a representation of the fact that John is in his car as he drives in. So it's not that he would ever have trouble getting in, so I can make an inference that that door was the house. This is robust, and I don't think any person would have any different intuition. However, if I said he had trouble getting out because the door was stuck, conversely, we'll have that as the car door for a lot of the same reasons, right? So I can answer a question like, where is John, based on those, and it's completely, there's not like any ambiguity about it, and all I got to do is flip in to out. And I really doubt that any models that we have right now would be able to reliably and consistently do this. Again, we're constantly filling gaps, again, by bringing things to mind in whenever we start to describe a sentence or a situation, rather. So, for example, if I say John shot the target, and I follow that up with the arrow hit dead center, and I ask, what is John holding? That will be a bow. If I say the bullet hit dead center, and I ask, what is John holding? That will be a gun, right? So these are both things that relate both, not just, oh, these things come to mind, but also they come to mind because they serve a particular function in with respect to the objects that have been described. Not the words that have been described, but the objects that have been described, right? And the roles that those play in the situation. And kind of going back to the difficulty of accommodating the bridging relations that I was mentioning earlier with the tasty dinner, it is still the case that people are really good at kind of trying to make sense of two different utterances that maybe don't initially make a lot of sense. And so Philip Johnson Laird has a lot of really interesting work that I recommend checking out. It's under, if you look under his work on mental models, and this paper on mental models and human reasoning has a lot of really great examples. But one of the studies that I really love there that he describes is one where they took sentences from different stories. So something like sentence 1, Celia made her way to a shop that sold TVs, came from one story. And they took a sentence, she had just had her ears pierced, from another story, and then basically just put them together. And then they asked people, so what's going on here? Now, they did have to do a couple things like fixing up pronouns and so on, so that they sort of flowed in that way. So it wasn't like Celia, blah, 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 and then Susan, blah, blah, blah. So they sort of fixed that up, but otherwise the content remained as it is. And so they just asked people, like, can you explain this? And they would come up with quite plausible explanations, right? Like, she's getting reception in her earrings and wanted the shop to investigate. Or she wanted to see herself wearing earrings on closed circuit TV, or she even won a bet and is using that money to buy a new TV. So this is the kind of mental simulation and storytelling that we're probably going to have to focus on for our agents to get better. This also, just as a fun example to show, there's this flash fiction genre where you basically have 6 words to describe a situation, and it's really amazing how rich these stories can be, right? He read his obituary with confusion. That's right there, just brings together a rich set of associations, and it's so much more than just a single representation for that sentence, right? We can build so much more on a representation that a person builds for any of these particular stories. It's just worth keeping in mind how much context we bring in and how much projection we can make given just a small amount of words. Meaning is also deceptively flexible. So, so much so that we even just don't even realize it most of the time. So if I say, get the banana, eat it, and discard the peel, the first banana I'm holding is the full banana, the yellow banana right there. When I eat it, I'm not eating the whole yellow banana typically. I'm eating the inside of the banana, and then I'm discarding this peel, which was actually part of the original banana that I had. And we do this just effortlessly. We don't even think about it. And we're probably going to have to grapple with some of that as we kind of move forward, and our agents will probably be confused by some of this sort of stuff. If I say, like, let's meet by the dinosaur, and I mean this dinosaur statue on the Google campus, well, actually, that's only a model, and it's a model of a skeleton, but almost nobody would have any trouble knowing that that's the dinosaur. We should also keep in mind that meaning is arbitrary, negotiated, and evolving. So we kind of think about things like an hour as a thing, but it's not a thing. It's a thing because we named it, right? And it corresponds to 1/24th of a day. But the ancient Egyptians had a term for hour that was 1/12th of a day and 1/12th of the night. And those times were different because over the course of the year, the night and day time periods get longer and shorter. And in both of these units were actually different because the day hours are measured with sundials and the night hours are measured using water clocks. So these themselves were arbitrary, but the word itself was still the same. Some measure of time that corresponded to 1/12th of a day and 1/12th of a night. And so on for other kinds of things like temperature, distance, and so on. We also often kind of forget that the meanings of words like tomorrow are themselves negotiated or have ambiguity in them that we might not have expected. So a nice example that my mom has is that when she was a kid, very young, like 3 or 4, she thought that tomorrow meant the next period of time after one has gone to sleep. And that's a reasonable inference for a kid to make. And she was really disappointed when her mom said that she was going to get ice cream tomorrow, and then took her nap and was like, where's my ice cream? And her mom's like, no, you don't get that until tomorrow. And that actually brings up another interesting thing, which is how we can quickly learn the meaning of a word, a precise meaning of a word like tomorrow, through a single instance and don't have to see billions of words of text. So I probably don't have to convince people who are part of this workshop that meaning is more than other words, right? It's not just what words do I correlate with or co-locate with and some kind of word embedding that comes out of that, say. But instead I have other things like properties, right? I might be round, I might be solid, shiny, small, or made of metal, and so on. And furthermore, I might have things that are beyond my properties and my collocational problems that are things like, can I open this door? Do I have to turn a handle, or do I have to pull a handle? Do I have to turn it, or do I sort of shake a weird door handle hand? So one of the things that I think might help us get towards that are ideas from things like conceptual spaces from Peter Yardentor's. And his key hypothesis is that meaning is multidimensional, and each dimension operates in a convex space. So this is kind of beyond just the, let's jam it all into some tensor, but instead we have different components, and those different components actually are structured, they're convex, and any kind of meaning point has to align up with some point in this convex space. And those convex spaces can be different kinds of objects. It could be a line, it could be sort of just a cube or whatever. And the whole takeaway from that is that, going back to what Ray Mooney has famously said, you can't cram the meaning of a gosh darn word or a sentence into a gosh darn tensor, unless maybe that is some kind of structured convex region that interacts at multiple levels, right? So now we can actually tease apart what different things are. And remember that we actually have words for talking about these kind of dimensions, like color and taste and texture and so on. We can have meta reference to these things, and we can negotiate the meanings of different kinds of things. So at the end of the day, like, I want to be able to relate our low level kind of neural realizations of things like color and taste, which we are, our taste sensors, our various senses are bringing in information to our brains, and our brains build low level neural representations of these things, right? And then we have words that talk about these things. And we need something that mediates the words to these right here. And I think some of the conceptual space work might be one way that we get at that in a tractable manner. Now, language compactly encodes complex past and future situations. So tense is a huge aspect of what people study when they're looking at language. And it's just worth keeping in mind, especially because all this work we do in things like vision and language navigation often does require thinking about the future, maybe where the future is some future moment in the path. And we use temporal language, as I mentioned earlier, to talk about actual spatial relations between things. And so it's worth just keeping in mind that linguistics has been kind of obsessed with this for quite a long time. And there's a really nice representation of kind of the relation between speech and an event that Reichenbach came up with quite a while back via his event nuclei. And just really briefly, what he distinguished was the difference between speech time, reference time, and event time. So for example, if I have a simple past and I say something like John left, I'm saying this at a speech time now, and in the past, the event of John leaving and the reference time of John leaving was in the past, and those were co-located. If I said John had left by the time I opened my door, now I'm speaking at this particular speech time. In the past is the reference time when I had opened that door, and the event of John leaving was in the past of that, right? So now you can have these sort of three elements interacting in a number of different ways, and those sort of cash out in different tense, future, past tenses and so on. They're encoded in different ways in different languages. And on the right, you see kind of hybrid logic representations of these tense situations. And I think we actually maybe need to think a little bit about how we can encode some of at least the intuitions behind things like representing tense in logics when we're thinking about our agents and how they're going to solve problems in both space and time. And Stephanie Telix and other collaborators at Brown are actually looking at things like linear temporal logics and bringing those explicitly into their models, including for things like room to room and robots running around and solving tasks. And I think it's interesting to kind of consider this interface between logics and the agents that we're building. And just to kind of try to convince you there may be more underneath language than you're often typically maybe considering if all you're doing is like looking at the language data that's associated with some task that you like to play with. There's a real nice breakdown that Mons and Steedman did a while back in terms of events and states and different types of events and how language realizes those, right? And so, for example, I don't want to go in tremendous detail in this, but definitely look up the paper. I have point processes like Ed hiccuped. That's something that just happens once. It's not something that's kind of ongoing, whereas a process like climbing is an ongoing thing. Like if I said Ed climbed, it wasn't just like he climbed and then stopped. Like climbing inherently involves a series of actions, right? And with either of these things, I can kind of have a culmination. So I can say I'd reached the top. That's the culmination of an event, but it's an atomic event. The reaching itself is a single moment in time, whereas Ed climbed to the top is a culmination of an entire process. And then there are just things that are states, like Ed is at the top. That's just a state of being, right? And interestingly, if I try to do different kind of temporal modifiers on statements like Ed climbed, I can say Ed climbed for 1 hour, but it's very odd to say Ed climbed in 1 hour, and so on. And so these govern what are actual reasonable kind of ways of modifying like a core sentence. And we might need to be thinking about these things. And in particular, Steedman and Mons suggested that there were actual like valid transitions between these different states that one could follow, and that can actually be linguistically used to coerce one kind of description of, say, like an atomic event, like a point like Sandra hiccuped, into a progressive state like Sandra was hiccuping. So these are just a few underlying processes that are worth keeping in mind as we go forward. Now, a lot of our work in vision and language navigation or embodied vision and language tasks involves kind of concrete stuff, right? You know, go here, move here, pick this up, and so on. But actually, one of the things that's so amazing about language is that we can do abstract thought, and we can talk about abstract situations. But when we do that, we tend to use terms for concrete stuff, and there's a good reason for that. So just as examples, the company went through a tough spot and finally arrived at profitability. You know, we're using actual spatial movement metaphors here. They cut corners when drafting the legislation and were left grasping for votes. They weren't literally grasping for votes. This is a metaphorical use. And what Srini Narayanan and others, collaborators at Berkeley in the late 1990s and early 2000s were interested in is how something like grasp the spoon actually leads to a mental simulation in the hearer of spoon grasping. And then the suggestion is that if I now ask somebody to grasp an idea, they actually run the same mental simulations in order to understand what grasp the idea is. And so this is maybe one place where we can try to get bridge, again, between kind of low-level neural representations of things like movement through space and actions in space. And these include things like low-level neural representations of overlap between units, or ingress and egress, and so on. And so there's kind of a theory that was worked out quite a while ago, and I'm interested in how we might be able to lift that into our kind of current neural architectures and terminology to be able to deal with abstract language in a way that is tied to concrete language and our understanding of concrete language. But to get that, we probably still need to make quite a bit of progress in understanding concrete language. So, and just to kind of put that point a little bit further, we really need to kind of, in some cases, merge both the concrete and the abstract to understand some concepts. So for example, a word like career brings in concrete aspects such as path, trajectory, journey, and concrete aspects such as milestones and landmarks, which are often parts of paths, and then ties those to other abstract concepts like work, specialization, and vocation. And so we probably need to combine the sort of concrete level understanding of what a career is in terms of paths and milestones, along with the kind of more abstract metaphorical word associations that we have, you know, back to good old Word2Vec and so on. And this idea is adapted from Joanna Bryson's paper in 2008 that kind of tried to mediate between concrete understanding and abstract understanding. And it kind of comes from her background as somebody who is interested both in distributional models of word meaning and robotics. So these are just a few, like just a small sampling of ways in which we know language maps form and meaning, and of linguistic phenomena in general. There's a huge literature, obviously, on many other aspects of language that would take years to go through. But I really recommend people check it out because I think we really need to understand aspects about like what happens in language and across languages as we think about these kinds of tasks and what kinds of data we're eliciting and what kinds of behaviors we should have from our models. And I think just to expect that human language competence will sort of arise if we just kind of set up our environments the right way is pretty naive, and I would say even hopelessly naive. That doesn't mean that we have to implement the formal means that linguists have proposed for dealing with these things, but maybe we should think about the kinds of ways in which they've structured the problems and the kind of questions and findings they've had about how language works as we're doing this. So just to kind of wrap up the final bit of this talk, I do think language is inherently part of intelligence, in fact, drives human intelligence. And as we think about what we're trying to solve in these tasks, it's helpful to kind of look at a couple of different definitions of intelligence, where if you look at, for example, this definition from Legg and Hunter, 2007, they say intelligence measures an agent's ability to achieve goals in a wide range of environments. And I think we're working on that, right? This is the kind of stuff we're doing with, say, like a vision and language navigation task or an Alfred task and things like that, where we do task-specific skills, and we have some generalization and adaptation across environments or across tasks. What we really should be aspiring to is solving kind of the bigger problem of intelligence, which is skill acquisition and bringing in kind of priors and the ability to use experience to solve new problems, right? Now, it's a big, tall order, but I think it's where we should be heading. And I recommend reading Francois Chollet's article on the measure of intelligence for kind of having a bit higher level of ambition in what we're doing. And I think language is a huge part of this. And to kind of very briefly summarize it, we have, as you know, in terms of our evolutionary past, been kind of planning creatures for somewhere in the range of 200 million years, possibly more. And the reason for that is our sort of ancestors, mammalian ancestors, and even before that, needed to be able to move around in the world and reason about the actions of other agents that might be eating them or might be food for them or might be mates for them, and figure out how to kind of survive in this very tricky world. And that required pre-linguistic representation of situations in order to be more effective. And Mark Steedman actually argues that this leads to, that this would have required manipulation of symbols and representation of other entities as symbols and reasoning about those symbols. Now, that then leads us into the sort of period of hominid evolution, like 5 million years ago, before you had Homo sapiens, where we were starting to use tools. We were starting to work much more in groups, like large social groups, and the ability of our vocal tracts to both produce more refined sounds and imitate the sounds of others were all kind of co-evolving, right? And I think that the technological hypothesis, which language may have emerged because it conferred a huge advantage on those who could efficiently communicate complex operations, probably has a lot to it, right? You know, this is, if you could much more quickly pass on knowledge to your children and actually to other people in your tribe, how to use this new tool that you came up with, that was going to allow that whole tribe to much more effectively survive and procreate and live on. So the other thing is, when we're working in these groups, you know, humans individually are not very strong creatures, but as groups we were formidable. And that cooperative behavior that we had by working in social groups and keeping track of who was family, and seeing if I took care of your kid now, would you take care of my kid then? And keeping track of these things, again, back to what Stephen said, may have involved some kind of manipulation of symbols and reasoning about those. And then the ability to do precise vocal imitation may have evolved very quickly if it conferred a huge advantage on those who could actually talk and talk back and you know, basically win out in the evolutionary game. And the cognitive coupling hypothesis sort of says that maybe a whole bunch of these sort of pre-existing neural mechanisms that were being developed in these different lines kind of led to an almost stepwise evolution in our ability to use language. Okay, so once we kind of had, you know, some kind of core language capabilities, maybe not as rich as what we have now, that sort of potentially led to this virtuous cycle in which we are able to lift language upon language, and in particular go from this kind of ability to talk about the concrete here and now and start thinking about future situations. And this is where, again, language sort of was perhaps even co-opted and gives the hooks to think about and create concepts that could then be talked about more effectively, which were not possible before we had the words to hook new abstract concepts onto, right? And I think this ties in a lot with the work on categorization and analogy that Hofstadter and others have talked about, where we have a set of situations and now we start to realize what's the abstraction over that situation and create a schema for that, and then be able to use language to talk about that schema. And you know, Hofstadter loves to talk about things like sour grapes as a great schema where a whole rich set of associations can now be brought in if I just talk about the sour grapes setting. So The role of language in human intelligence, for me, is informed by this kind of scale of different work where we can think about it going from general cognition. Again, you know, that previous slide was sort of like starting up here with planning, pre-linguistic planning, and moving on down. Now let's flip it a little bit and go from side to side. And Barbara Tversky has been thinking about spatial cognition for many decades and has a nice recent book called Mind in Motion, where she really argues that our ability to think is very much shaped by our ability to take actions in the physical world and characterize physical spaces, and that we think about things very much in terms of their physical relations to things. And there's a ton of like merit to that, and I think that's a great starting point. But I do think that we need to like not give language short shrift. And so this is where things like the geometry and meaning that Peter Yardenfors has expressed, where he tries to start tying low-level convex spaces over things like color and taste and so on to linguistic expression, starts to play out. And then Steedman's arguments about the emergence of language coming from planning, like he makes an argument that our ability to compose plans, such as reaching behind something and grabbing it rather than having to look and reach behind it, is essentially composition. And that composition may have been part of what allows us to do recursion in language, that maybe is cashed out in things like composition in a categorical grammar, for example. Now we start to move beyond just like particular things like meaning representations or syntax, and how our planning capabilities and physical understanding of the physical world are related to language, into actually maybe language is pretty fundamental to thought, right? And it's not just an afterthought, as it were. And this book by John Ellis, Language, Thought, and Logic, really lays this argument out, where he makes the argument that you actually can't think in the sense that people think without language. And the point is not like a Worfian argument, although he defends Worf in a really interesting way. His point is not like the language you speak dictates how you think, right? That's the sort of straw man's Worf thing that linguists are taught to hate and dislike. But instead, it's the fact of language is what allows you to think, right? This now ties nicely into discussions that you have in the Enigma of Reason, where they make an argument that we often think that we're thinking about things in this sort of rational sense, but actually a lot of it is us talking to ourselves or talking to other people, and that language is what allows us to lift our thoughts beyond the sort of kind of low-level thinking about situations and so on into abstractions. And in particular, as linguistic speakers in a society, we can express ourselves about some proposition, and that coalesces a whole set of bubbling neural activations into kind of a thing that other people can, you know, metaphorically hold and consider, and then kind of see how that, you know, mashes up with their own low-level neural understandings of the situation. But then it becomes kind of a crystallization of something that we can now talk about and reason about collectively as a society. So, for example, the proposition that language plays a fundamental role in human intelligence is something I'm kind of putting out there right now, based on what other people have put out there. And now, you know, you can kind of go like, well, what do I think about that? Let me hold this and consider, is this full of crap, or is this something that I should, you know, maybe consider a little bit more deeply than I would have otherwise? And, you know, maybe like one other thing to sort of put in the mix in that is this argument that Noah Yuval Harari makes in his book Sapiens, that language is what allows us to create shared fictions about things like religions and monetary systems and the existence of a company like Peugeot. These are not things that exist in and of themselves, but they come into being because we talk about them and we agree that these are things that can be talked about and acted on. And then our behaviors follow this shared fiction. But without language, we couldn't establish this shared fiction, and certainly not at the scale that we do of a single society, or certainly at the level of the entire world. And this is where I want to say language lifts experience, right? It's not just that, grounding, the experience grounds language, but instead language also lifts experience. And so there's kind of a virtuous cycle in all of this, to the point where we might say that there's language-driven cognition in human beings. So to finally sort of connect this back up, there's this whole tying out with in embodied language to figure out how does language connect to the real world. We also kind of have to look inwardly, I think. And there's a paper that I worked on with my co-authors, Jay McClellan, Felix Hill, Maya Rudolph, and Henrik Schutze, where we tried to tie together essentially Jay McClellan's long-term interest in parallel distributed processing and kind of following theories that followed on from that, like complementary learning systems theory, and really focusing on these kind of core PDP principles of emergence of structure and mutual constraint satisfaction, where what we want is representations that arise for intelligent behavior and understanding that arise from embodied agents that build situation representations rather than just independent language or vision representations. And this goes back to like why I was hammering on the idea that we need to build situation representations in order to answer these kinds of other problems, like, you know, what is John holding after he shoots an arrow? Or, you know, what inferences can I make about John if I said John couldn't get in because the door was stuck, right? These require some kind of other representation that's going on. And one of the things that Jay and others have argued is that we need some kind of fast learning system, which in people is the medial temporal lobes, that allow us to support arbitrary associations between our new context as we are encountering a situation where we're talking with other people or reading a story or something like that, and relating that to our own semantic memory and pulling those in as necessary so that things are available and ready for us to understand a situation. And one of the sort of suggestions we make is that query-based attention techniques that are very popular these days and lie at the heart of BERT and many other kinds of models are actually a really nice way of thinking about implementing mutual constraint satisfaction that mixes between all these modalities. And I think we're seeing more and more of this kind of cross attention between modalities and representations. But the argument here is we need to make this every which way, all the way. So how do we make that happen? Not quite sure yet, but our suggestion is that we'll do our best at making this happen if we are in the context of embodied agents that are learning in environments. So to really get at that, I think we need to play the long game. And this is coming from a number of different sort of sources, I think, and we're starting to see a path toward this. My own team got going in large part by this paper, Points, Paths, and Playscapes, that we wrote back in 2018, where we basically argued we needed to make progress on language understanding by working on large-scale spatial language understanding tasks. And one of the key arguments there was that we didn't want just like one-off tasks, but we wanted to actually get into playscapes where we have maybe a game that involves agents interacting with people, and fundamentally using language as how they solve problems and puzzles and you know, kind of do well in the game. And you know, importantly, as I mentioned before, we're thinking about photorealistic environments or the actual real world. And so augmented reality setups such as the Google Maps gaming API, where I could have game elements in the actual physical space and other people interacting with each other and with game elements that are in this space, would potentially allow for a really rich way to get kind of the best of both worlds of kind of gaming environments, as well as not letting go of our connection to the material world and real world locations. I also am really excited about work that's being done with Habitat, where, you know, we're moving these environments like Matterport 3D and other related 3D environments into a continuous movement space with physics and the ability to drop in 3D objects and those kinds of things. I recommend going to aihabitat.org and looking at some of the videos and resources that they're building there. I think that a lot of those kinds of utilities are what we're going to need to make progress on these kind of grounded tasks and getting us to this world scope 5 that the Experience Grounds language paper has argued for, which is that we need to be not only embodied, but interacting with other people and agents in these kind of grounded environments. And that's what we're going to, that's how we're best going to get toward these situations where we can set up our agents for success in terms of learning really rich representations. I'll show this. So in conclusion, I really want to sort of stress that I think we're on the right track in not just using text-only representations. They are really useful, but they sort of slosh the concrete and abstract together, and it's a bit too indiscriminate. And I think embodiment and interaction are crucial for kind of teasing these things apart, allowing us to learn concrete representations for, you know, for concrete language, but then lifting those into the abstract via more controlled mechanisms, such as these ideas that I was mentioning from Srini Narayanan and others, and also through things like conceptual spaces as proposed by Peter Yardenforth. But I really want to stress that I think language is trickier and more valuable than you might be inclined to think. I think often when people are in this sort of mix of computer vision and language, it's like, well, language is just another input. Actually, I would like to argue that it's not. Language is what helps us structure and understand our world, both in terms of the current world that you're in and in terms of the kind of future worlds that you imagine and the past worlds that you would like to be able to still talk about, and fictional worlds that you create, right? I mean, people have arguments about what's valid in Lord of the Rings and Star Trek and Star Wars and so on. None of these things exist, but yet people act as though they exist, and there's huge stakes in these things. Okay, so I really think that models are unlikely to just figure language out if we just kind of set up the environments and give them some data to work with or people to talk to. We probably really need to think about a situation where what we want is for language representations and overall representation for how language relates to other things and how we represent information in situations to be emergent. But what we need to do to get there is to structure the problems and inductive biases and our environments such that this occurs, right? And when we're doing that, we should embrace ideas and findings from linguists and cognitive scientists and others who have thought a lot about these problems, but maybe had different kinds of formal tools and technologies to address them. And we don't have to adopt their particular proposals for addressing them in all these cases. Sometimes maybe we do, but often we probably don't, because they might be just not as relevant or useful compared to what we have nowadays. But still, they thought deeply about the problems, and it's worth spending some time with the discussions and thinking that they had about those things. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and hope you enjoy the workshop and discussions that are ensuing.